during the call and response section with Mr. Allard, and before I start with my remarks, you notice that there was probably a little bit of a subtle difference between what you were singing and what I was singing. It's not only about the pitch in a call and response, but it's also responding to the nuances, to the scoops, to the accents. Music is a language in itself, in that it depends on not only sound or pitch, but also how things are accented, whether they're short or whether they're scooped. Boop, rather than boop, ba-da, or, you know, there are certain nuances, and these were integral. These were integral to the workers in the fields in the 1850s, because the way a call was made really sent word to what they were really talking about. So the call and response is extremely important, not just for the melodic theme, but for the nuances that are provided inside of those melodic themes. I'm really talking about the Harlem Renaissance tonight, but to really appreciate and understand, fully understand the impact of the Harlem Renaissance in American society and American history, it's really important to go back those 50 years and talk about the war song. Because the nuances that they used in the fields, you know, often meant life and death to people. Because obviously, I'm sure many of you remember the, you know, the story of the Underground Railroad, and it's really not what people said or sung to each other, but how they sung it, which really led to the proper directions for someone to escape to the north. You know, which house to go to, where the safe houses were, how they could get over the Mason-Dixon line. All of that was done in context of the work song. So the work song was not only a song of work, but it was also an anthem for freedom, for the slaves in the fields. So there was a lot more at stake here than just the art, or just, you know, taking up the time in work and making work move along, making time move along. A lot of times we use music in a recreational way to sort of just, you know, help some time pass along, give us something to fill empty space. You know, these folks were doing things that were far more important. And that's why it's such an integral part of the black culture, and why it has become a part of the jazz culture. Because the nuances that take place in the conversations are what really mean. It really makes the meaning of what's being said, either musically or, in the case of the work song, through their communication. Taking it back to their homelands, and in Africa, you know, again, through drumming and through their chants, they communicated. It's how tribes communicated. So it's, you know, it's very important that we understand how important a communication tool the war song of the 1840s to 1860s or 70s were. Once emancipation occurred, the easiest way for the blacks to move from the South was up the Mississippi River. So the first urban centers to really begin to see some type of black culture were the cities along the Mississippi: St. Louis, Kansas City, and, you know, Chicago. Basically, those three cities, if you study any type of jazz history, you'll find that there is a profound difference between St. Louis blues, Kansas City blues, and Chicago blues. Because there's a whole history of the people who settled there and how they began to speak, how they began to communicate through music. When the emancipation took place in the black churches, the spiritual became a very important musical form. If you were here at the concert a couple of weeks understand that the spiritual was just that. It was a song of spirit. It was a song of hope. For the first time in history, blacks were free people, or so they thought. And they were free to move. However, freedom has a lot more to it than just knowing where to go, or just being able to go wherever you wanted to go. And what they found is after several decades and being in these cities, there was a new form of music that began to happen, and it was called the blues. The blues first was created in 1903. The first blues tune ever penned was the St. Louis Blues by W.C. Handy, recorded by a famous vocalist of that time, Gertrude Marini. The blues was really, at that point in time, the anthem where the spiritual was the anthem of hope. The blues became the anthem of hopelessness. Because what they were finding is even though blacks were able to roam wherever they wanted to roam, there was still massive amounts of oppression that kept them down as a people and as a culture. So even though there were pockets in these cities that they could begin to congregate and exude their culture, there was still much oppression around them, and they were still very much alienated, and they were still very much discriminated against. And their culture belonged to them and really nobody else. I have a trivia question for you. All right? We've talked about slaves moving up the Mississippi River. Anybody who really knows people like Steve Miller or Stevie Ray Vaughan, who were some very good blues guitar players, who grew up and crafted their blues in Texas, and there's a whole style of blues called Texas blues. Trivia question for tonight is, how did the blues get to Texas? So chew on that one for a while. I'll come back to it. But how did the blues get to Texas? Over the years, I think the history books, as Dr. Renane was referring to, calls it the Great Migration. But from 1900 through the next decade, or 15 years, blacks began to migrate into more inland urban areas, primarily Philadelphia and New York. At the same time that there was a migration to New York from the West, there was also a migration to New York from immigrants from Afro-Caribbean nations, British West Indies, and basically they all ended up in this part of New York between 120th and 140th Street, which came to be called Harlem. That neighborhood in Harlem, people began to feel safe. They began to share their culture. They began to run into New Yorkers who said, wow, this is interesting. I'd like to learn more. And now all of a sudden, as they began to share their culture, there were white